Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bill Brownfield. I arrived at this organization a year or so ago as a diplomatic fellow, and now, for reasons completely unclear to me, I am a distinguished fellow of the Wilson Center. Wilson, a center that was founded some 50 years ago by the United States Congress with the mission of offering and supporting study and research on matters of international relations and national security in a decidedly nonpartisan manner. Today, we are not just privileged, but pleased to have with us an individual that can help all of us to address and understand what I call the 24-year-long slow-motion Greek tragedy that is Venezuela today. A nation that, in a sense, started the year 1999 with some sense of hope and promise for the future, and year by year found each of its key institutions, political, democratic, economic, social, inflation and finance, citizen security, public health, free press, millions of refugees, the legislature, the judiciary losing any and all independence, until we reached a point 20 years later, in the year 2019, when the National Assembly, at that time the only political institution in Venezuela that had the recognition of virtually all governments in the world for being an independent and democratically elected institution, took a new approach to Venezuela. And they established an interim constitutional president and government. Not because he self-selected and announced himself, not even because the National Assembly voted him into this position, but rather by a constitutional process. The National Assembly first made a decision that the 2018 presidential elections were fraudulent and therefore null and void. Second, pursuant to the same Constitution, determined that the office of the presidency was therefore vacant, since the allegedly elected individual had his election declared null and void. And third and finally, through the same constitutional process and article, by the Constitution, incidentally promulgated by and eventually pushed through to ratification by Mr. Hugo Chavez Frias in the year 2001. And by that Constitution, in the event that the office of president was vacant, the President of the National Assembly would assume that office until such time as a new election could be scheduled. And that individual is seated at this point approximately 8 feet from me to my left. From 2019 until 2023, the international community, the democratic opposition, and some 57 governments that recognized this interim government tried a new approach to address the issues of democracy and human rights in Venezuela. Some called it maximum pressure, others called it using sanctions, indictments, and international multinational organizations with resolutions and declarations to urge, encourage, or if necessary, and if this is your preferred verb, to compel the government of Nicolás Maduro to follow a democratic and constitutional order. Did it succeed? I will tell you that in January of this year, 2023, the parties, the majority of the parties that represent the democratic sector in the National Assembly today decided to go a different route. And historians will argue undoubtedly for decades to come who is responsible, who is to blame, who was at fault. I would offer you one comment, that anyone who wishes to address this issue cannot with any seriousness suggest that the fault lies with the previous interim president of Venezuela for lack of courage, lack of conviction, lack of willingness to make tough decisions. They made their decision in January of this year to go a different route, but I dare anyone to be able to blame Mr. Guaidó for lack of intense effort to produce a democratic outcome. We are now in a new era, if you will, within the international community, and this represents the decision to move to a different sort of interim government in January, a new political reality throughout the Western Hemisphere with changes of government which has altered the landscape of what they are prepared to support and do, and, admittedly, a new approach here on the part of the United States government and the current administration. And we are seeing and have seen adjustments in terms of sanction policy or indictments, a new approach in terms of supporting more dialogue and more negotiations. And we will see eventually if that produces the outcome that those who support democracy so desperately want to have. But I will not be the final introducer here. That honor goes to the distinguished congressman, administrator, ambassador, and most important for me right now, executive director of the Wilson Center, to take over the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Ambassador Mark Green.
Thank you. Ambassador Brownfield, with that rather rhetorical flourish that he added, I think he's showing why he is a distinguished fellow here at the Wilson Center. Thanks, Bill. Thanks very much. Mr. President, welcome. Welcome to the Wilson Center. It is good to see you again. The last time we were together was 3 years ago in this very building, different wing of the building, but we were together. As Ambassador Brownfield noted, you were President of Venezuela, recognized by 57 countries around the world, and I told you then how honored I was to welcome you to USAID. As you know, USAID's role in those days and continues was to manage and direct relief funds for the Venezuelan people. We did not provide direct assistance to you or to the interim government, but you did help us understand the landscape in Venezuela, and that helped us to make sure that Nicolás Maduro could not capture these dollars as much as he wanted to do, but instead they would go for the benefit of your people. 3 years later, some things have changed, and much has not. What hasn't changed is your personal courage and leadership. I told you when we were together in 2020 how much I admired your leadership and your personal courage as well as political courage. You had to deal with constant threats, harassment, and violence. What also has not changed is Maduro. His thuggery, his brutality, his mismanagement. When we were together in 2020, you had just finished meeting with Boris Johnson, President Macron, and Prime Minister Trudeau. You met with President Trump in the Oval Office, and you attended the State of the Union speech, and you were given multiple standing ovations, both sides of the aisle, from Congress. The biggest change, of course, now, last week in the face of arrest threats, persecution, threats to yourself, threats to your family, threats to those who have served in the interim government, you undertook the difficult and perilous journey to go into Colombia as preparations were underway for an international conference on Venezuela's future. I hope to hear more about it, but you were asked to leave, and with the help of the administration, you were able to come here. So, Mr. President, my first question. Given the threats that you have faced for quite some time, what prompted you, what caused you to undertake this journey to Colombia now? And what happened to you and your family when you reached Colombia, if I can?
Mark, gracias a todos. Gracias por la amable y cálida recepción. La buena noticia para ellos.
The good news for them is that they are able to say these things in Washington. Sadly, for those who are fighting for our freedom in a dictatorship, is that we face the threat of torture, persecution, being vanished. And this is why we came to talk about this and why I went to Colombia. I went to Colombia precisely because in the case of Venezuela, it's not just yelling. And obviously, you know, these people that came here had an opinion. It might be different from mine, but it's respectable. We were able to have a debate. But in Venezuela, if you do that, you expose yourself to murder, to torture, to being silenced. And that's why I went to Colombia. I was hoping to bring the voice of many Venezuelans, to make them heard, that they would be taken into account to talk about Venezuela. And that's the least we could ask for, you know, those who are actually putting our skin in the game to face a horrible threat. And speaking about Colombia, today my eldest daughter turned 6. Her favorite movie is actually set in Colombia. I mean, I don't know if you know it. It's called Encanto. And it tells a story of a family that has to flee because they're persecuted. They have to cross a river. At the beginning, she didn't like the movie very much. She used to cry with the persecution scene. There's a song that starts out very sad. It's beautiful. It's about 2 caterpillars that grow from when they're very little and then they become butterflies. I have 2 daughters. I tried to watch the movie with her to tell her about the stories of many Venezuelans that are forced to flee, that have to seek shelter somewhere else, that have to keep pushing forward. And that's why we went to Colombia. We went, and fortunately, my family is safe today. They actually reached the U.S. on Monday. And today, Encanto, that movie about a family that flees, that's persecuted. When a Colombian person watches it, they think about Colombia, but Venezuela also can relate to it. When a Venezuelan watches that movie, they think about their family. And we haven't published this image, but this image also belongs to my family, and all my respect to the person that helped us, because their life is on the line as well. This is Miranda 2 days ago, crossing the river. She was afraid. And she was afraid of that when she watched it in the movie. And this is a situation, Mark, of millions of families. And I went to Colombia, Mark, precisely to carry the voice of so many millions of Venezuelans that have suffered that because of the dictatorship, because of persecution. No one leaves their country just because. Nobody seeks asylum or shelter just because. Unfortunately, the treatment we expected was not met. Very often, the Colombian government offered kindness and support to Venezuelan refugees, and maybe we didn't expect that, but we certainly expected dignified reception. We did not expect to be received with a direct threat of deportation. We did not expect to be threatened to be sent back to Venezuela. It seems that Maduro has greater influence in Colombia than even the U.S. in that sense. Because that decision was made by Petro. He decided to see the case of a political refugee, a persecuted person, and same with my family. They were retained for over an hour when they tried to cross over to Colombia. And they did that just because we were trying to face this dictatorship. So I left Venezuela after being persecuted, and I found myself in a very similar situation in Colombia. And I am glad that the U.S. was able to intercede for me, and where I was able to get a stamp on my passport, and I was able to make the most of the situation. Going to Colombia was a very complex process. I had to take a car to Bogota, and it was incredible, to go by land from where I was to Bogota with the same ideas that Simón Bolívar carried with him, the same ideas of fairness and democracy. And for me, I confess, it was a total surprise. The attitude of the Colombian government, the attitude of the Petro administration, which seemed to be closer to the government of Venezuela than other democracies in the region.
Mr. President, to pick up the discussion, so we know that negotiations have been taking place in Mexico. We know that there has been an attempt by the Petro administration in Colombia to be involved in the process. And there's a lot of discussion in Washington, D.C. about the role of sanctions and whether or not sanctions can help to restore democracy to your country. Why do you believe that the negotiations, the discussions in Mexico have failed so far? And what advice, what ideas do you have about sanctions and how the U.S. should approach sanctions?
Gracias, Mark. A ver, las sanciones y la
negotiations and the talks this is sort of at odds with each other. It's an error. It's a big mistake. I think there's different approaches, and Venezuela's interests and those of us who are resisting and on the ground is to solve the crisis. When we speak of the anti-sanction or maximum pressure approach, this is at odds with something that has to do with the tools involved. For an agreement process is successful, there has to be sufficient pressure for a dictatorship to give in. And voluntarily, a dictatorship is not going to give in. I've heard hundreds of arguments against the sanctions, and so there needs to be pressure. There has to be an approach and if there's an approach that's friendly, for that to be enough to move them away from Russia or China, no, that's naive. That will not work. A soft approach. The economic approach is not enough. And so that's what's happened with Putin himself. When people say that the sanctions are not working, and then dictators like Ortega, it's as if they're not responsible for what they do. There has to be pressure on them because these are the few tools of sanctions that the free world has to call to account this type of regime. It would be an incentive for Maduro if I'm persecuted today. That's why I'm here as a survivor of a dictatorship, but also challenging it if there's no immediate consequences, what's going to happen for those who are on the ground? What was the destiny of in Belarus, in Nicaragua? The tool of sanctions is a tool, and it can be improved upon like any tool. It has to be followed up on. For it to be effective, there's got to be follow-up to it. I know it takes resources and time of the administration of this administration, the European countries, but resources and time. And if we don't do that, there'll be a proliferation of dictatorships, and so that's what we have to do. That what they're doing is persecute me. Borrell was in Colombia. I don't know what was done, but the tool has to be improved. Together with Mexico, or perhaps maybe there could be an agreement and provide incentives for a solution to the conflict in Venezuela. We've said it till we're blue in the face. There has to be fair and free elections.
If President Maduro announces tomorrow he wants elections and he welcomes elections, is that enough?
The problem with a dictatorship is that you can't believe a dictatorship. But until the 300 political prisoners are released, they're behind bars. And to set a timeline, to set deadlines, and an electoral observation mission has to be discussed and has to be implemented, because the dictatorships. So what the dictatorship is, Maduro's regime is trying to do with this negotiation is to sort of normalize dictatorship. And with the outreach of Petro to Maduro is sort of normalizing, the dictatorship. Maduro, he wants to normalize this dictatorship and getting around all the issues that are there in Venezuela that are going on. So to remove sanctions has a direct effect on seeking a solution.
That really your great fear, that what is happening in Mexico, what is being talked about in Colombia, that it would have the impact of normalizing the dictatorship? Is that the fear?
Yes, that's the main consequence effect if there is no timeline laid out. A year ago, there was an official visit for the United States to Venezuela in March of last year, where there was direct engagement with the dictatorship. That undermined the engagement, the interim government's process, and even for any possibility of a negotiation. There's two paths: either direct negotiation of the United States with the costs entailed to negotiate with a dictatorship, or empower those who are on the ground and to work out a solution. We have to be consulted. We weren't consulted about that visit. And so that's my concern. Any approach to a dictatorship without having the tools to hold them accountable entails, obviously, normalizing. And we, the Venezuelans, it leads to us to forget things, the atrocities committed in the Venezuelan jails, and there continues to be destruction of the Amazon basin. And we cannot ignore it and just sweep it under the carpet. There has to be pragmatism, but we're an oil-producing country. We were an oil-producing country. We're no longer. But as long as there's not legal certainty or trust, we're not going to be an oil producer. And we're not going to do it by lifting the sanctions. We, Venezuelans, believe in private enterprise, in oil production. And that's why I said the anti-sanction lobby should stop we have nothing against trying to achieving lifting the oil industry back up. But what we want is for it to be sustainable and respectful to Venezuelans and the millions. And then with regard to migration, you can't use a kind of soft approach with this dictatorship. Only there has to be, only if there were democracy there. There isn't. So we can't take him at his word. He's a dictator. And with all this transnational crime, we can resist on the ground. We showed that we're able to organize and do it. But how do we contain Russia? How do we contain China from coming into there if the exact tools to be able to do so and to fight on the ground? And then we also have to understand well the energy issue, not only with regard to the United States, but the whole world, the energy picture. We're a country that's well aware that we can be a trustworthy provider of energy, but not removing sanctions or granting licenses. But we have to once again become democratic for that to happen.
For a question or two, but if you can, as we discussed before we came out, my fear is that with so many things going on in the world today, that Americans may not have awareness of just how terrible the situation is in Venezuela and how much your people are suffering. Can you, since you obviously have just been here a few days, can you talk a little bit about what daily life is like for families in Venezuela right now?
Venezuela today, in the heart of Venezuela, the people where I grew up, where I was educated, $6 a month is what a teacher earned. $6 a month, not a day or not a week, per month. I'm saying $6. So I ask any of you to live on $6 a month, and as an empathy exercise, but Venezuelan with $5, can you imagine? Multiply that by 29 days without public transportation, always power outages, a regime that wastes and shows Venezuela that they buy luxury items, and there's unsustainable advertising, and even there are things that not even they can purchase, and that a journalist is afraid to even tweet, has to erase it because out of fear of the consequences. And when he or she takes to the store, goes outside, he looks both ways and looks behind him or her to see if she's being followed. And then if it's an opposition member, you don't know when it's an opposition.
It's democratic and prosperous. The most prosperous in the world.
Exactly. And if it's an opposition member, additionally, add to all that it'll be tough for anyone to even come up to you. Nobody wants to engage with you because they don't want to be linked with you. And so there's isolation. You're alienated. So there's family members who visit political prisoners who try to bring them food. The free press today, by the way, it doesn't exist in Venezuela. They can't mention the names. They don't even mention the names. That there's no newspaper print available. When you go to Venezuela and you look for a newspaper and a magazine, there aren't any. And if there's a medical emergency, there's no way to get any care at the hospital. I'll wrap up with this, but I mentioned this yesterday. There were shots fired at my house in Caracas, while we were trying to get from one part of the city to another, for example, with all these roadblocks, and to find gasoline to be able to tour the country. The dictatorship, while this was going on, was investing thousands, millions of dollars to co-opt the opposition leaders. That's their game. And 29, they called it Operation Scorpion. And Alex Zapp, you know, he's in jail in the United States. You know about him. And there's the example of how you can efficiently sanction and following up on all these incidents. For example, Alex Zapp, look at his case. And we try to use all these tools to resist the dictatorship and its propaganda. And I conclude, I wrap up here. I just want to underscore that, remember, on May 1st is a day where thousands of workers who earn $5 a month and have the right to protest, they do continue to resist and protest on the streets of Venezuela. That's the way it was. But 2 decades later, we continue to do it. I used to do it. It used to be done. And I am trying to speak out on behalf of all these people.
Thank you. We have time, I think, for 1 or 2 audience questions.
Hi, good afternoon. Please, if you could just stand up and state your name and organization.
Mi nombre es César.
I'm Cesar Baez. I'm Venezuelan. I come from Táchira. And before asking you anything, Guaido, I would like to thank you for your fight, and not just you, but everyone around you, Leopoldo, all of them. I think that, like any other Venezuelan, I am slightly skeptical about the current state of the fight, and I have a very specific question. From your perspective, what do you think went wrong on April 30th? Because that day I left my Catholic college in Táchira, and we were on the streets, and we found at the end of the day that we failed to attain our objective. And I think that that's a question in the mind of many Venezuelans, and I'm glad that you're here to answer it. Thank you. Cesar, thank you so much for being here. And thank you also for your skepticism even, because that should drive us to be better, to correct our mistakes, and to push forward. I think the biggest difference from January 2023 and December 2023 and 2018 was that we believed. We are still the majority in Venezuela and around the world. We are still resisting, and we are trying to channel our actions. On April 30th, there was a lot left to say, but to me, what we attempted to do, because we attempted to stage protests in Venezuela, and what you were saying about protests, the same argument could be applied, for example, to elections, negotiations, protests, or trying to, establish a dialogue with the armed forces to establish a democratic transition in Venezuela. If you analyze this separately, you could say today that none of these things separately works by itself. However, what we need to do is transform that, Caesar. We need to understand the multidimensional quality of the dictatorship we're facing. We were naive in that sense. We need to understand the ties and the size of the dictatorship we're facing. We underestimated Maduro and his link with Russia and with criminal multinationals that supports the elite that is still in power and that fears the action of international courts. There are many families, many NGOs that are being brave by resisting. April 30th was a peaceful political act because it was necessary for many sectors of society to start the transition. And we need the armed forces to carry out that transition. Now the armed forces understands the fragility of a dictatorship that completely depends on, economy or the support of Russia, direct support from Russia, as well as other powers. What could we have done better on April 30th? I think that's a valid question as well. One, to have a direct dialogue with those who were at the helm of the armed forces, sectors that were ready to stand by the Constitution at that time. There were people that, moved too fast, people that didn't move too fast enough. This has to be taken into account as well. But facing the future, Mark, which is something that we need right now in Venezuela, and that's what we need in Venezuela, we need to get those tools in our toolkit. When we talk about sanctions, we need international pressure. We need to reorganize internally, and that's what the primary means to us, to regroup a little bit internally in the country. We also need to find support to avoid another Nicaragua, and that's part of my agenda right now. Basically, that's what the dictatorship wants. We want a just transition, but we need the support of the armed forces, and we need to avoid these false dichotomies that it's or maximum pressure or negotiation. This is a false dichotomy, and those pushing for it are just the interests on both sides. Those who are advocating for a solution, those who feel for Venezuela, those who hurt for Venezuela, can only do what we can to maximize the usage of our tools. And we need constructive criticism on our part as well. We don't have enough tools right now. We just don't have them. And not just in Venezuela. I'm talking about Nicaragua, I'm talking about Belarus, Cuba, Sudan, Hong Kong. We need to improve our toolkit if we want to curtail the migratory flux, if we want to avoid the further destabilization that Russia is driving in countries like Venezuela and in other obvious cases such as Ukraine, and of course migration flows that have to do with Russia and many other countries and the problems derived from it, drug trafficking, illegal gun trafficking, the destruction, and I insist, of the Amazonian jungle, which has been directly financed by guerrillas. And this has to be taken into account, for example, on April 30th, given the role that the armed forces had. Thank you, Cesar, for your question.
President, my name is Karim Tambi. I'm a friend from Uganda.
Friend of Bobby.
Yes.
Are you friend of Bobby?
Yes, I'm with Bobby Wine.
Thank you. Say hello
We
to.
share a commitment for liberating our people from repressive regimes. And I wonder what's the message from you for the people of Uganda who have been trying to get liberated from the dictatorship of President Yoweri Museveni for 37 years. Thank you so much.
Gracias y salúdame a Bobby. Hemos estado en contacto.
Thank you, and please say hi to Bobby. We've actually been in touch over issues that concern us, Uganda, Myanmar, Nicaragua, and Cuba, people that are fighting ceaselessly for democracy. Somehow, we, even though we're not alone, we are alone sometimes. In 2019 and 2020, if you had asked me, I would have said, I'll return tomorrow. And I'll remember Navalny's return to Moscow. When Navalny returned to Moscow, and I'm sure many of you remember, that day was a day of anxiety for me. I was telling Fabiana, they're going to put him in prison. They're not going to forgive him. Fabiana told me, what's going on? What's with you? And I told her, he's facing a dictator. They're going to put him in prison. And she said, calm down. You've already done that twice. Do you understand me now? She said. Do you understand what we've gone through in this process? If you asked me if I can return Venezuela the way that in 2019 or 2020, I am sure that I might meet the same fate as Navalny. We need to put a lot more pressure on these authoritarian regimes. We need to revert those incentives. Basically, dictators nowadays have all the incentives to win, and we have to put on our part. We need to get organized. We have to mobilize. I am aware of the risk. I have suffered it. We've seen the results in Uganda, and we've suffered in Venezuela. But we need to lift up the acknowledgement of our fight. We need to be pragmatical in seeking possible solutions, so that not only you, Caesar, will be able to believe, but also the city will be able to believe. Again, there's a current of thought that says that, Mark, if we are kind to the dictatorship, that we tend a friendly hand, that we might be able to, ease the economic situation and therefore, ease migration displacements and normalize the dictatorship. But that's normalizing the dictatorship. That's giving up. How can we ask 30 million Venezuelans, or in the case of Uganda, millions of people, 7 million of Ugandans, right? And how can we ask them to just give up, to resign themselves to the situation? We can't. So my message is that we cannot ask them. We cannot feel resignation. And I understand the position, that many cities and countries are in, but we're going to do our best on our part to find solutions. Obviously, faced with this threat from these powers, we need more support than ever in order to translate that into feasible solutions. And this might sound paradoxical, but it should not be just attractive to the news cycle, and not just when it's trendy, not just when it's attractive for the newsrooms to support a cause and to get all signs with Sharpies like Free Venezuela, Free Uganda. We've seen this. We've seen this in Cuba, Patria y Vida, like Homeland and Life. Fight for democracy is a fight of resistance as well, not one of resignation. That path that leads to the normalization of dictatorships cannot be taken. And it could, you bet, it can create future wars. Ask Ukraine. If you want to be pragmatic about it, what's best is to seek a solution that stabilizes through democracy, that curtails migratory flows, improves democracy, improves freedom, stabilizes the global market, prompts the development of the oil industry, and we improve the development of the country and region. But if you want to look at it from the side of those who suffer this dictatorship, I'll tell you that from a human point of view, we need support. Please act for human dignity, for the respect of human rights. As I said, Bobby, in Uganda a while back, you have a voice. Make yourself heard. Make yourself heard for something that unites us, which is democracy. And it's not a romantic notion, by the way. It's not some ethereal notion. It's the first step in the path to progress and peace. Thank you.
I want to get in line and meet the famous Bobby from Uganda. I feel like that's maybe the next event we do here at the Wilson Center with Bobby. Before giving it back to Ambassador Green to close out our session, just one thing I want to comment on. Around town there's a lot of talk about Venezuela, and we must make it clear that, as the lady said, people are starving in Venezuela. It's absolutely correct. But that is because of Nicolás Maduro. It's not because of sanctions. And that even years before one sanction was put in Venezuela, the people were already starving. there was already malnourishment. The kids didn't have enough to eat, and people are already migrating before one sanction ever stepped foot in that country. So the fault is not the sanctions, the fault is the Maduro regime, and that's what we got to keep a focus on. It's because of Maduro that Venezuela has become the second largest migration crisis in the world.
The first one. The second one.
Well, UNHCR says it's two. You and Syria are like right there neck and neck. Neck and neck. But that is, more than Ukraine.
Not a contest you want to win.
That's right.
Oh, no, we don't want.
More than Ukraine, more than Yemen, right? We're talking about a country that is not in a war, and yet this is the migration that's coming out of it. So that's something that we cannot forget. And the last thing I will say, there's a lot of folks in town who talk about the rise of authoritarianism worldwide, but also within Latin America. I will say that while that is happening, and I think President Guaidó has made a very eloquent case on what it's like to live under a dictatorship, I will say to you, Mr. President, that you also give us hope, right? For the people of Cuba, of Nicaragua, of Venezuela, who continue to fight, who continue to risk their lives, while the dictatorships unfortunately are still in place, you all give us hope that freedom will come to these countries, and we thank you for that. And with that, Mr. Ambassador, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us today. As I think you know, the people of Venezuela captured my heart. The tyranny in Venezuela broke my heart. I am confident that history will look on your leadership and bravery favorably. Someone who, despite threats to his own life, threats to his family, stepped up against a brutal and ruthless tyrant whose hold on power has largely come from far-off places like Beijing and Moscow. Your courage gives us all hope, and your clear voice is very helpful right now at this moment in Washington, D.C. We need to hear it, and I hope it won't be 3 years until I see you again in person. But again, thank you for joining us, and thank for all that you've done. Thanks to all of you.